So let's welcome Dr. Munn. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here this afternoon. I enjoy these gatherings, and I think that they're a sign of a healthy society, that groups like this can get together and, in a sense, shoot the breeze on important topics. And this is an important topic. What I propose to do over the next half hour is share with you some considered thoughts of a relatively general nature. Of course, Australia and the Asian century is a vast topic. And you may have questions about aspects of what's happening in Asia more generally, or about Australia's policies and posture that you'd like to ask, and you're very welcome to ask those questions. But I hope that what I'll be able to do in the next 30 minutes is set the scene for a really interesting and productive Q&A. I was saying to somebody just a moment ago that about 5 years ago I was invited to talk to a group of 500 Year 12 students. And it turned out that the address was on a Friday afternoon and there were two prior speakers. And I sat in the audience watching these two speakers read their papers to the kids. And I observed that the kids were just nodding off. And there weren't terribly many questions afterwards. So I had come with a prepared speech, but I thought, no, I don't think so, not this afternoon. And so I said to them, I'm not going to give you a speech. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, making, I hope, a few thought-provoking remarks. And then I want to hear what's on your minds, because education is about that give and take. It's about opening things up. And to encourage you to ask good questions, I said, I've got two prizes to offer. The first is my book on China. And the second is my book on Western civilization. And I brought along today a third book, which was not in print at that time. It was only published early this year. It's called Credo and 12 Poems, a cosmological manifesto. And in a manner that I hope will resonate with many of you, if I may put it this way, given the point that you are in your lives, this was my attempt at a point last year when I was bordering on terminally ill to distill my thinking after 40 years of reading and scholarship and travel about how the world works and what's really going on. And it was published last January, and I'm happy to say that since then the doctors tell me I've beaten off the enemy. And hence I don't look terminally ill, do I? All right, so that said, as I said, I do have a set of prepared remarks which will cover a bit of this ground, and in a few moments, in order to stimulate thinking about the general conversation, I'll show you one scene from a film that was released at the turn of the century. I like using that term because it sounds like a long time ago. You think of 1900, but of course it's 2000. And it's a thought-provoking scene because it has to do with the plans of the first great August emperor in China, Qin Shi Huangdi, to unify the Chinese world under his power. And a dwarf in his service presents this view to the Prince of Yan, who was a hostage at the King of Qin's court, by way of overawing him and saying, this is going to happen and you better get used to it. And I think in a, if I may say so, a somewhat ominous way, there is a certain resonance in our time. And it's a good film to watch from that point of view. All right, so we will have plenty of time for Q&A. I'll speak for about 30 minutes, I estimate. And I understand that people are often invited to speak for 45 or even 60 minutes. I won't keep you that long. We'll be into the questions before you can blink, I hope. All right, so a few days ago, an old friend of mine from my days in military intelligence called me from Singapore, declaring that China is exerting intense pressure on Singapore to not accommodate American strategic plans in Southeast Asia. During the week, we have seen reports about Paul Keating criticising the Labor Party's defence spokesman Richard Marles for saying that the government must authorise the Navy to decide when to undertake freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea to defend Australia's interests and send a clear message to China. Keating also expressed concern that Labor is too compliant in its attitude towards US naval interests in the Western Pacific and should adopt a more independent outlook that better balanced our strategic and economic priorities. That same morning, there was a report that the Department of Defence had learned only hours before the decision was announced that the port of Darwin was to be leased to the Chinese for 99 years, something which set off alarm bells in Washington, D.C. This morning, the acerbic Greg Sheridan mordantly remarked that the coalition has discovered its inner mouse when it comes to the South China Sea. A few days ago, I had a chance meeting with a friend who holds what might be called a sensitive position in Canberra. He asked whether I had time for a coffee, and over that coffee confided in me that he now believes Australia is being subjected to a systematic Chinese attempt to infiltrate and manipulate our institutions at every point: business and government, media and education. He is a highly intelligent and very well-informed person, and he is correct. As my friend who had called from Singapore put it, China is playing hard and for real, but we don't seem to even understand that the game is underway. It's going to be over before we have realised what's happening. His words, not mine. Welcome to the debates that are now intensifying over the rise of China and its implications for Australia's interests and our future. It's a very large topic, and I expect that this afternoon we shall have a lively conversation about it. I'd like to set the stage for that conversation by playing for you an excerpt from The Emperor and the Assassin, an excellent Chinese film by the great director Chen Kai-ge, released in 2000. Xi Jinping these days talks of the China dream as he consolidates dictatorial power in China. In this film excerpt, we see the dream of the first August Emperor of China in the 3rd century BCE, expounded by a dwarf in his service to the princeling of a nearby kingdom. We'll stop it there. You get the general idea. I don't know if you could read the subtitles. Unfortunately, they were sitting a little low on the water. But I do recommend the film. It's readily available on DVD, and as you can see, it does have subtitles, which with a little more leisure you will be able to read. But it's a very stirring film, and I would just say briefly about it that one of the beautiful aspects of it is that Chen Kai-ge takes an historically recorded story about the first August Emperor and an attempt to assassinate him because he was perceived correctly as a tyrant with overweening ambitions. But he inserts into it an element that's not in the original story, and that is that the emperor has a mistress, played by the glamorous Gong Li, who is almost like a modern woman. She relates to him very freely, and she criticises him for his harshness and tyranny, and finally turns against him. And when the film was made, I wrote a review of it in which I said, it seems to me at least, that this is Chen Kai-ge using Gong Li as the voice of those in China who want to see liberalisation, who are complaining about Tiananmen and the Chinese Communist Party's abuses of human rights. And it was being used in a time-honoured theatrical mode as an allegory, held up in front of the Communist Party in the present time. Well, we had hoped for many years that the Communist Party would see its way clear to political reform and liberalisation. Certainly in the 1980s, it seemed that was on the agenda. Since Tiananmen had just not been on the agenda, we've held on to that hope for some years. Xi Jinping has shut the door on that. And that raises some very significant implications for how we deal with China and what might occur in the region in the years ahead. So will there be peace in our time with the new Chinese Imperium? That is something we must all increasingly ponder. What we need to understand is that Xi Jinping is the Qinshou Hundi, the Chinese emperor of our time, and that we are already in the position of the Prince of Yang in this film scene. We urgently need to wake up to ourselves and think about our future, or it will be circumscribed for us in ways that we may come to regret. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, China awarded the 2015 Confucius Peace Prize to none other than Robert Mugabe, the corrupt, brutal, incompetent dictator of Zimbabwe, for, quote, overcoming a number of difficulties and contributing to building the government, economy and order in Zimbabwe, while continuing to work actively at the age of 91 for peace in Africa, unquote. The Confucius Prizes were introduced after the Chinese Communist Party became riled at the awarding of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, one of the chief architects of Charter 2008, which called for political liberalisation and respect for human rights in China. The Chinese Communist Party denounced that award as, quote, an obscenity, unquote. Its own award to Mugabe is simply almost comically grotesque. Last year I stated that there are two sides to this coin: the ugly face of the Chinese Communist state with its unrepentant support for Mugabe and Kim Jong-un in North Korea, but also the probability that China will be unable to win the trust and confidence of the advanced democratic and liberal states around the world, which now include many of its neighbours. The disturbing evidence of political and strategic disarray in the United States, however, is badly undermining confidence in America. A year on, I am more concerned than I was, and more concerned that China moves relentlessly and purposefully while the United States flounders and we dither. Having made such dramatic remarks, let me say that it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Early last year, I chaired a public debate on religious belief and civil society at the State Library. I remarked that evening that I saw such a debate as belonging to a great tradition dating back to the classical world. It reminded me of the debate St. Paul had with the Stoics and Epicureans on the Areopagus, the Hill of Mars, in Athens 2,000 years ago, in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17, for those who still read the King James Bible. Our little gathering this afternoon also stands in a great Western tradition, and I emphasise Western tradition, of public and open-ended discourse about matters of common concern. This kind of gathering is what might be called an Athenian one, of a different kind, in its open and free canvassing of matters of public moment. Kurt Rafflog's The Discovery of Freedom in Ancient Greece and Joseph Ober's The Athenian Revolution are leading explorations of the idea of freedom of speech and public discourse. I'm Paul, but not St. Paul. And I've come here to talk not of God and resurrection, but of worldly affairs in a frank and open manner, and to discuss them with you. And I want to urge that we remember, in the present context, that Athenian democracy failed for all its virtues. The free Greek city-states squabbled and dithered and were conquered by the Macedonian monarchy. Demosthenes, in his famous speeches, exhorted the Athenians to rearm themselves against the power of Macedon before it was too late. They did not, and they paid the price. We now stand in a roughly comparable strategic position. You are here this afternoon because of your interests and concerns as citizens of a Western democracy on the fringes of the Asian world. I am here because I undertook decades ago, initially, to study Western history, then international relations during the Cold War, but have developed a keen interest in Asia because of what has been happening in my lifetime and because of its importance for Australia's future. The subject of my doctoral dissertation was US counterinsurgency strategy throughout the Cold War in Southeast Asia and Central America. I then went to work for the Defence Intelligence Organisation and was assigned to concentrate on Asia as an intelligence analyst for the Australian government at the very time when Japan began to stagnate, China began to rise, North Korea developed its nuclear weapons, Hong Kong was being prepared to be handed back to China after a century as a British Crown colony, and Taiwan was democratizing. It was 1990, and Ross Garnaut had just published his report, Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy. For the past 20 years, having left government service in 1995, I've been a public intellectual and a businessman, a somewhat unusual combination. My business has been applied cognitive science, or in layman's language, critical thinking skills. Over the past decade, starting with a book called Thunder from the Silent Zone, Rethinking China, I've had 7 books published. I have 2 more in the works. The Secret Gospel According to Mark, and Against the Caliphate, Memoirs of the Falcon, an historical novel. The 4th of my books is called The West in a Nutshell. The 6th is called Opinions and Reflections, a free-minded work, 1990 to 2015. The 7th, published last summer, is the one I showed you earlier, Credo and 12 Poems, a cosmological manifesto. I am, in other words, not short of opinions. But I'm not an ideologue or a lobbyist. Unless freedom and civilized values are considered an ideology and insistence on freedom of expression is considered to be lobbying, I am, like you, simply a thinking citizen in an open society. And as such a thinking citizen, I put it to you that the words the Asian century presuppose what may not turn out to be the case, that the 21st century will be dominated by Asia. It is not self-evident that that is what will happen. The art of prediction is a tricky one, as the old saying has it, especially when it concerns the future. In a book called The Long Boom, A Future History of the World, 1980 to 2020, by Peter Schwartz, Peter Leyden, and Joel Hyatt, published in 2000, the same year that The Emperor and the Assassin was released, the unfolding of the early 21st century was confidently forecast in the following terms. We are watching the beginnings of a global economic boom on a scale never experienced before. We have entered a period of sustained growth that could eventually double the world's economy every dozen years and bring increasing prosperity for, quite literally, billions of people on the planet. We are riding the early waves of a 25-year run of a greatly expanding economy that will do much to solve seemingly intractable problems like poverty and to ease tensions throughout the world. And will do it without blowing the lid off the environment. If this holds true, historians will look back on our era as an extraordinary moment. They will chronicle the 40-year period from 1980 to 2020 as the key years of a remarkable transformation. In the developed countries of the West, new technology will lead to big productivity increases that will cause high economic growth. Actually, waves of technology will continue to roll out through the early part of the 21st century. And then the relentless process of globalization, the opening up of national economies, and the integration of markets will drive the growth through much of the rest of the world. An unprecedented alignment of an ascendant Asia, a revitalized America, and a reintegrated Greater Europe, including a recovered Russia, together will create an economic juggernaut that pulls along most other regions of the planet. These two megatrends, fundamental technological change and a new ethos of openness, will transform our world into the beginnings of a global civilization, a new civilization of civilizations that will blossom through the coming century. Charming words. Well, here we are in late 2016, and this is not what is happening. All sorts of things have gone wrong from this rosy Schwartzian point of view. Starting with the e-tech stock bubble bursting, then 9/11, followed by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, then the global financial crisis, the euro crisis in Europe, the implosion of the Arab Muslim world that was initially greeted as the Arab Spring, and now the slowing of the Chinese growth surge, which only a short while ago was widely believed to be unstoppable. Political liberalization has been hoped for in China since the 1980s. Xi Jinping has slammed the door on it. In short, the future was not so predictable in 2000, and we should be skeptical about robust prognostications now. Before the turn of the century, newly out of the secret intelligence world, I wrote a long essay about the rise of China, in which I cautioned that too many economists and geopolitical analysts were committed to what I called the linear ascent model. The idea that China would rise inexorably. Who'd like to kick off? Yes.
You just touched on it towards the end there, about, which strikes me as sort of issues of leadership and management. Is Australia just similar to everyone else? It's just the basic Cain-Abel human factor that's in play in humanness? Or are we lacking something? You know, is it a matter of that we've got a smaller gene pool than others? Israel presumably is much smaller than we are. Yeah, it's good. So yeah, our problem seems in leadership, but that seems to be endemic throughout the world. As you know, is there any hope for future leaders?
There's a couple of phrases you used there which bring to mind anecdotes, which I'll share briefly before more directly addressing your question. The first is when you talk about what you call the Cain and Abel general problem of humanity, what Kant called the crooked timber of humanity. I was at Victoria Market a couple of weekends ago, just doing my weekend shopping, and I walked past a stall selling fabrics, including rather nice-looking carpets and tablecloths, and I thought, I could do with a new tablecloth. So I stopped and talked to the vendor, who turned out to be an Iranian immigrant, and we had a pleasant conversation. And I said, "So how long have you been here?" He said, 4 years. And I said, "Are you feeling dug in?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm feeling good." And he said, "How about you?" And I said, "Oh, well, my family's been here for 5 generations, but I mean, it's only about 100 years longer than you have, you know." And he said, with a smile, he said, "Well, at the end of the day, we're all just human beings, aren't we?" And I said, "That's the spirit." And I shook his hand very warmly, because we've had so much unpleasant and awkward discussion in recent years about immigrants from his part of the world. But the other thing you mentioned there was about, what was the other anecdote? Now I'm going to forget it. Because your question is the important thing. The gene pool. Yes, do we have too limited a gene pool? I was going to tell a humorous story, and forgive me, I can't remember it, so if it comes back to me, I will. But what I would say is this. When people try to figure out what are the causes of the rise and decline of nations, the success or failure of economies, they tend to look at all sorts of things. The best evidence that I'm aware of suggests that the variables are not, in general, genetic or geographic. They're certainly not racial. They're institutional. Right? So the best way to encapsulate that is if you look at China under Mao and China since Deng Xiaoping implemented reforms and opened China to world trade and foreign investment, you see a stark contrast. Same country, same gene pool, right? Same history, same geography, dramatically different results. If you look at North and South Korea, same country, same history, same geography, same gene pool, dramatically different results. What's the difference? The difference is in their institutional orientation and their economic policies. If you look at Israel, it set out initially, when the Zionists created that state in the 1940s, to be a kind of socialist utopia. That was based on two misunderstandings. One is that they still believed, despite the evidence of the 1920s and 30s, that they would find a way to get along with the Arabs. And the second was that they thought socialism was the way to a progressive and humane human future in which we could all prosper. By the 1980s, they had come to realise that peace with the Arabs was a distant dream. It was going to be very difficult. They also realised that the socialist notions that they had entertained were not a formula for economic success, and they began to implement reforms. Israel has now become, despite its endangered location and its very small size, and despite the fact that it invests a great deal in its military for security reasons, has become a high-tech boom economy with rapid growth and a model for anybody who wants to take what, at the beginning of Israel's history, was an endangered, narrow, arid stretch of land and create a prosperous state, to listen to us all in other ways. I remember visiting Israel a few years ago, and I was taken by taxi from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and fell into conversation with the driver. His name is Noah Greenberg, and he said his grandparents had come to Palestine in the 1920s from Russia and Ukraine. And quick, of course, well, they got out just in time, didn't they? And he said, yeah, and he said, my parents grew up here. I was born in 1948, the year that Israel was founded. And he said, when my family came here, there was nothing here but a few Jews, a few Arabs, and some desert. Now it's a good country. Well, it is if you're Israeli anyway. And that is it's a remarkable result. But the simple answer to your question, to bring it to a close, is institutions. And we have some good institutions in Australia. But if we want to look to a creative and robust future, it's there we need to look and not get hung up on race and geography and so forth.
What's the percentage of Australia's GDP going into defence, and do you think the direction of submarines is in fact advisable?
Yeah, two questions. Well, the percentage of Australia's GDP going to defence, last time I checked, about 1.7%.
0.7?
1.7, yeah.
1.
Give or take 0.1. The Gillard government cut it back. Abbott then said we're going to restore it to 2% when we can. Well, we're not there, and he's not there. The submarines are an interesting question because, and I may say parenthetically, I was involved in running workshops for the submarine program on the arguments going back and forth, which was a very interesting exercise. The essential argument for having submarines is that Australia is a large continental landmass with a small population, huge maritime boundaries, and a long way from the things it needs to keep an eye on in terms of sea lanes, for example, in terms of trade. And the only way to do that economically is to have good submarines. That means expensive submarines, it means long-range submarines. and submarines of a kind which very few people in the world make. The Europeans don't do long-range submarines. The Americans do, but they tend to use nuclear submarines, and we don't have a nuclear industry because nuclear power was judged to be verboten back in the 1970s, and nobody's going to bring it back. So it needs to be long-range conventional submarines of a kind peculiarly suited to our needs, and nobody really makes them. So we've had to hunt around for a modified version. And with the Collins-class submarines, we got it wrong. We had problems with the design and with the maintenance. The report that was done on that appears to have identified where exactly the problems occurred, and in principle, and this is an institutional thing as much as anything, that means we can learn from our errors and get it right next time. But whether we will, I don't know. And, you know, a sobering lesson is the Joint Strike Fighter, which is another major investment that looks very dodgy at the moment. They've had endless problems with that. And this is some concern. About a decade ago, when this debate was still more or less open, I gave a talk to the irritation of some defence officials in which they said, given that everybody agrees we don't face an imminent air threat, given that we have the Hornets and we can extend our lives a little, and given that beyond the next generation of manned fighter planes, air power is likely to depend increasingly on sophisticated unmanned aerial vehicles, why don't we invest in that, spending considerably less money, and skip the Joint Strike Fighter? Well, people said, you know, amongst an iconoclast, he would say something like that, wouldn't he? But they didn't really want to debate it. And right now it's beginning to look as though the Joint Strike Fighter is a lemon. And we've got sunk costs. We put a lot of money into what may not actually be a workable combat aircraft. So the question, I think it's fair to say, was that China is spending more on the military, but the US spends a vast amount. Is China's expenditure relatively insignificant compared with America's, or not? That's the first one. Yeah. And my answer is that it is rapidly growing in significance compared with America's. Hence my observation earlier that only 10 years ago, China spent less, not only than America, it spent less than Japan, Britain or France. Now it spends more than all three of those states combined. The US military expenditure has actually been dropping during that time. And an important thing to remember about US military expenditure is they spend extravagantly on pensions and entitlements. All right. So China gets more bang for its buck. That said, there's considerable corruption in China, and it's not entirely clear that the money that they're spending is always being well spent, because the PLA is a big interest group, and it's like any bureaucratic organisation. It has an interest in growth for its own sake because it's jobs and perks. Right? China hasn't fought a serious war in a long time, and while nobody wants to see a serious war take place, it's important to realise that if you haven't used your military forces, as we say, in anger, and you come up against somebody who is well trained at that and experienced, you can come to grief very quickly. The point at the moment, however, is that China is banking on the fact, or at least the perception, that nobody's going to push back because nobody wants that war with China. And so they're putting out markets, they're creating facts on the ground and on the water. They're pushing the margin and just testing all the way along the maritime littoral. Can we push back? The Japanese, the Southeast Asian states, the Americans. And they're growing, as I said, rapidly in the capability to do that. The danger is, of course, when a state starts doing that kind of thing, most of its states, this is an historical pattern, don't want confrontation. So there's a lot of talking and manoeuvring and bluffing. But sooner or later, if the ascending state pushes too far, people will resist. And because the ascending state by then may become habituated to lack of resistance, it doesn't take the resistance seriously. That's when the war starts.
Where does Russia fit in the picture? It seems to align itself with China on various things. Is it any type of, I don't know, potential threat or anything? Where does it fit?
Well, Russia under Putin is an interesting study. There are two ways to look at this, but fundamentally it's important to understand that Putin represents xenophobic nationalism in Russia. He represents that part of both the Russian people and the communist elite, the old communist elite, the KGB in particular, that resent the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Putin remarked some years ago that the collapse of the Soviet bloc was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. It's a remarkable claim when you consider the competition for that description. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's a preposterous claim, but never mind for the moment. The point is that there's a lot of emotion behind that. Not just personal emotion in Putin, but among many Russians. So the question is, if you look at that with some degree of empathy, if you say, let's put ourselves in the shoes of those Russians, you can spin a plausible story that they've been treated shabbily, that they've been neglected, they've been humiliated, they've lost status, etc., etc. That said, Putin is seeking to regain that lost ground, and that's a problem, whatever degree of empathy we feel for Russian resentment and humiliation. And hence, they've fought a cyber war against Estonia. They're playing a game of bluff with the Baltic states. They've invaded and taken territory from Georgia. They've invaded and taken territory from Ukraine. And this has got not only the Ukrainians and the Caucasian states, but Eastern European states considerably worried, because their perception is that neither the United States now nor the EU has the gumption to stand up to Moscow. And Putin, as any bully will do, is thinking, well, I'm just going to push the margin and see where the resistance kicks in. And I think that both Beijing and Moscow will be looking at the current disarray in the United States and thinking, let's make hay while the sun shines.
Seems to me that the sort of rule-bound institutional arrangements for the settlement of international disputes has been under increasing pressure, particularly in the last decade or so, 2 decades or so. You've got any observations to make about the particular character of Chinese pressure on those institutional arrangements?
Yeah, one way to address that question is to consider that although relations between states go back a long, long way in history, in the world as we understand it and experience it, the idea of international law essentially begins in the 17th century. People generally hand-wave about Westphalia. For those who aren't familiar with 17th century history, this arose out of the 30 Years' War, where Europe began to tear itself apart. And thoughtful people are going to say, this just doesn't work. Now, those wars had a lot to do with religion, Catholics and Protestants. And people started to try and think, how can we set up a framework in which states as such understand one another as entities and more or less abide by a set of rules that will limit the damage they do to one another through this kind of strife. That worked in Europe, notwithstanding what Europe was doing to much of the rest of the world in the 19th century, but it kept the peace in Europe pretty well until the 1914. The First World War, of course, was largely an unforeseen catastrophe. And the ending of it was mishandled, and so we got the Second World War. And at the end of that point, leaving aside for a moment the League of Nations, which was itself a failed experiment, the United Nations was set up, and the World Bank and the IMF were set up to try and re-equilibrate the world and set up rules that would enable people to trade and keep the peace. And again, you can say that, notwithstanding the tensions of the Cold War, that worked tolerably well. And in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, it looked as though it would work even better, because it looked as though, well, we don't have a bipolar world anymore. There's no communist world trying to bring that down. What's not to like about this? And then a few things started to go wrong, and we discovered that the rules themselves didn't always work. The world was changing fast. That the United States, by which I mean primarily Wall Street and the Federal Reserve, made serious, let's be charitable, errors. And in that context of feckless policy and fiscal failure in the United States, and of growing tensions and uncertainty in the world at large, China's economy is growing very rapidly. And I think it's fair to say that until 2008, a great many economic advisors to the Communist Party were very happy to learn from the United States. They thought, we want to be wealthy and powerful like the United States, and we keep sending our kids to US universities. When the global financial crisis hit in, I think a good many people in China thought, we're going to have to make this up our own way, because the Americans actually don't know how to do this properly. We can't rely on them. And so I think what's put the international framework somewhat in jeopardy is a growing sense in China in particular, more than other places, that they have both the capacity and the prerogative to reshape the world. but they're not being altogether communicative about how that will work for everybody. They seem chiefly concerned with how it will work for them, and that's a problem because this isn't a unilateral system. So there's a lot of thinking to go into that. Right. So I'm being asked, where do we stand with the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Has it happened, or what's going to happen? The shortest answer I can give to that, and also the most honest, is that it hasn't happened, and I'm not clear whether it has. It seems to have gone quiet, and I think one of the reasons is because it was largely, an American idea, and the political parties in question are now in a funk about that. Hillary Clinton wavered on it, and Trump's all over the map. So I think we're going to have to see the dust settle after the US election before we have an intelligent conversation again about that. And if Trump, despite everything, manages to get elected, we won't have an intelligent conversation again.
What's with this new Filipino president and his carry on? He seems to be aligning himself somewhat to Russia and China, and given the Chinese apparent incursion in the South China Sea, what's your opinion about the futures of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. As most of you are doubtless aware, he's quickly been nicknamed Duterte Harry because of his extrajudicial executions, and it's a bit of a slur on Clint Eastwood, really. but it's humorous in his own way. It's just that what he's doing is certainly not humorous, and I'm not sure how many of you have crossed this, but at last estimate, at least 2,000 people have been shot out of hand in the Philippines in the name of busting drug gangs and cracking down on crime. Now, this has happened in other places at times. It happened in Indonesia under Suharto a couple of times and got reported here. And there are people who say, look, when you're running a country like this, happened in Brazil, I think, at times as well, I should add, that the law and order problems become so intractable that it almost becomes a state of war, and an exercise like this is about saying, yeah, well, we're going to win the war, that's all. And gangs can be serious problems. In Jamaica, which I visited a couple of years ago, there had been a time, until very recently, where Kingston was more or less held hostage to drug gangs. And the government finally thought, we can't deal with this on our own, and we've got to stop it. And so they got the US to come in and help them, and they broke the drug gangs. And the same happened in Panama some years ago with Noriega, where the US actually sent in the Marines. So I wouldn't be quite so oblivious to say there's no justification for Duterte doing what he's doing, but clearly, once you start down that path, you're breaking all the rules. So who goes next? There's one thing to get criminals, but the political opponents, innocent people, any number of people, can fall under the wheels. What's a little more ominous is that Duterte is now one of a set of people who've arisen in the world who think that democracy is basically nonsense. As Erdogan says, democracy is a way of getting there. It's a train that you take till you get to the station and you get off. And they think that Putin and Xi Jinping are people to admire because they're successful strongmen. Right? Now, the Philippines is never going to be a great power, but if Duterte starts to think and strut the Philippine stage like a Putin, then odds on he's going to want to cut a deal with China. The question is what happens when many Filipinos who say, listen, China is near and dangerous and a bully, and we've been friends with the United States for 100 years. We don't want to go down that path. You'll get a political rupture in the Philippines. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Does anybody hasn't asked a question just before I go back?
Yes, I'd just like to ask, media. I know I'm just changing the subject slightly, but the current imagery that we get through digital broadcasting, photography that is immediate, drawn by hundreds of millions of people who use their mobiles to instantly spread emotional images and what may well be lies that eventually become accepted, that can influence and to take away substance, subject, basic substance of serious discussion. You see images of emotion and subtlety that is just beyond imagination. And I've only got to give an example of what we've seen on recent television coming from Congress or coming from in the States in this nomination.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to know how can we demand free press, but will we need to curb the press, or will the press come to understand the sense of urgency that could develop with the outcome of the China-Russian Western?
Yeah, there's something to say about that. I think the social media phenomenon, of course, is so new and it's moved so fast that nobody really understands at the moment quite what to do about it. I think that is a genuine challenge. And there was a very interesting piece some of you may have read in The Economist a few weeks ago, in which they referred to the Black Lives Matter movement and said, you know, if you watch the reactions to what have been some shootings of black Americans by police, you'd very quickly form the impression that violence against blacks and concern about racism in the police force is getting out of hand in the United States. But if you look more carefully at the long-term data, the aggregate data, you will discover something astonishing, which is that racial harmony, racial integration, and improvement in the management of crime have actually been growing. You know, that things have, in an important sense, never been better in those respects in the United States. But you get exactly the opposite impression from the viral images of a few incidents. It was a very thoughtful piece and quite eye-opening, because I had been as susceptible as anybody else to those images and what they appeared to suggest. I should add in that context, just enlarging on the question of perception and reality, because a free press that's authoritative and responsible, which we used to have. I grew up when the Melbourne Age was a serious newspaper. We valued it because we thought we could rely, and I think it's true to say we could often rely on newspapers to be responsible, to be informed, to be well edited, and to address significant issues. But you can't cover everything. And one thing that has become apparent to me, because my wife is Venezuelan, is that when we talk about violent crime in this country, our standard reference point for things being bad tends to be the United States. Every time there's a mass killing in the United States, it's all over the media. And it's very difficult to avoid the conclusion, the gun culture in the United States, this is just crazy. Why can't they do something? Now, these are reasonable questions, but we need to put it in greater historical and comparative perspective in order to avoid errors of judgment. And so I put out to many people, international homicide statistics are kept in terms of the number of people per 100,000 who are murdered in any given year. In Australia, it's 1, which translates into about 300 homicides annually. In the United States, it's 4. So no surprise, we see the United States as much worse than Australia, because it really is. But Mexico, it's 20. Colombia is 32. Venezuela, 27. Anybody want to guess what Venezuela is? 65. 65 per 100,000. I was in Venezuela in April this year, and when I arrived in Caracas, the briefing I was given is, do not casually walk out of your hotel. Don't think about just having a walk in the street. If you're out in public, go by cab wherever you go. Do not speak English audibly in public. You make yourself an immediate target for mugging or kidnapping. Do not carry a camera observably. Do not wear an expensive-looking wristwatch. Right? These are just rules of the game. Now, I went from Venezuela to Brazil, and I knew that Brazil was in economic recession, political crisis because of the impeachment, and of course that its big cities have a lot of poverty and high crime rates. I knew its homicide rate. But I tell you, when I got into Rio de Janeiro from Caracas, it was a breath of fresh air. And it tells you how bad it is. Now, I use that to illustrate, right? And I should add that the United States homicide rate has halved over the last 30 years. It's not spiraling out of control. It's been brought under control to an appreciable extent. So this is illustrative of a broader phenomenon. When we think about world affairs, when we think about economic developments, when we think about inequity and poverty. We have to get this kind of serious and comparative data, but overwhelmingly we don't. And the viral media always latches on to emotional images, as we say. All right? That plays havoc with general understanding. What is to be hoped is that because there's so much of it, that somehow or other, in a marketplace of ideas, on balance, truth wins out over fiction. But that remains to be seen. Yes, who hasn't asked a question yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
How prudent is it that Northern Territory government have leased the Darwin port for 99 years?
Yeah, it was frankly a big surprise. I mean, as I was saying, the Defence Department apparently learned about it only hours before the decision was announced. I only learned about it hours afterwards. And you've got to ask yourselves, what motivated that? Was it a kind of naive perception that, well, we have this huge trade relationship with China and having the Chinese in the port is going to enhance that trade relationship? What's not to like about that? Was it as simple as that? I'm not sure. Was it a degree of corruption? Was it people in Northern Territory quietly taking money for the Chinese in order to facilitate this deal? I frankly don't know. I'm not going to make allegations, but such things are known to happen. Is it the case that such a lease, when rigorously examined, might sound worrying, but actually there's not much to worry about? Think about the question of Chinese investment. You know, people it's a bit like the viral media question. We know that many Australians have started to think, oh, you know, Chinese investment's a bit of a worry, it's too much, they're moving in. It's important to remind ourselves that Australia has always required foreign investment, being a huge continent with a small population, and that the overwhelming bulk of the foreign investment that exists in Australia now is British American and thirdly Japanese, and the Chinese is a tiny sliver by comparison. Now, in any given case, it could be that a particular investment needs close scrutiny, but that's why we have the Foreign Investment Review Board to look at individual cases. And in a couple of cases, they've said, no, we won't allow that investment. Right? If you know those elementary realities, then you can relax a little about Chinese investment. Similarly, when it comes to the port, it might have been good to have had a public debate, or at least a federal level debate about it before it was announced. But it remains to be seen how it will play out. The important thing is to be clear that we're a sovereign state, and if China starts to abuse its lease of that port, given their marching orders, that's the important underlying question.
Just to pick up on your point that we're no longer a backward given the growth in China. Australia's had a long-term involvement in Antarctica. Focus has been particularly on environmental issues generally, from what I can see. I understand that China's got a growing interest in Antarctica as well. To support your point that the pivot has changed as far as we're concerned. What do you think are the fundamental drivers of China's interest in Antarctica?
Well, China, it won't surprise you if I say this, China, if only because it's a very large country with an economy that, even though it's slowed down, is still growing at about 7% a year, which therefore has an enormous appetite for natural resources. So the Chinese have been going out everywhere, Africa and Latin America, Australia, looking for resources and trying to get preferential access to them. So there's no doubt in my mind that Antarctica is primarily resource driven. And a very rough parallel, since Antarctica we think of as in terms of marine territories and nature preserves as much as anything, is we think about the long-running issue of Japan and fisheries, and particularly whales. So there's a substantial and indeed lucrative market in Japan for varieties of fish and for whales. And the development in the last half century, of course, of industrial techniques for catching fish and killing whales have driven many of these species to the edge of extinction. Have we been able to get the Japanese to altogether cooperate in this? Well, no. And that's Japan. And Japan, since the Second World War, has in most respects been a very cooperative member of the international community. China is new to this game. And so we've got to expect that in the best circumstances there will be bumps and difficulties along the way in sorting that out. But that said, of course, obviously with regard to the global commons, it's very important that we reach agreements that people genuinely respect. And we all know that there are some important domains in which this is being attempted right now, and it's not getting a lot of traction. It's very difficult, and for game theoretic reasons, which one can understand, it's very difficult to get everybody to cooperate for the common good. Somebody referred to Cain and Abel earlier. I mean, the default setting of any animal is to look after number one first, and human beings are no exception, and states are no exception. And so getting cooperative agreement is challenging. Antarctica is simply one case study among many.
Having had some experience in defence, particularly submarine, in relation to submarines, it's intrigued me that they wanted to increase the submarine fleet, which currently is 6, is that correct? Or
6 when they're operating.
When they're operating, yeah. There's only about 2 or 3 who are actually in the water at any one time. But submarine crewing is voluntary. And I was a psychologist, and part of my job was assessing for submariner suitability.
Yeah.
If they're going to increase, has it been thought of? Are you aware? You know, how are they going to man an increased submarine fleet?
Yeah. Sorry. Let me say 2 things to that. One is that in a lot of ways, to a dismaying extent, the decision about the submarines has been handled politically rather than, let's say, strategically. First of all, it's a sort of almost a top-of-the-head announcement by Kevin Rudd, who was rather given to that kind of thing, that we're going to double our submarine fleet. This, of course, led to various people in Beijing saying, oh, is this directed at us? And, well, no, of course, it's not directed at you. And then the question is, well, if we're going to double our submarine fleet, how are we going to do that? What kind of submarines? When will we get them? And where will we build them? And, oh yes, how will we crew them? Well, let's deal with that when we get to it. We haven't got them yet. I don't think it's, I mean, look, it's probably a bit glib to say that nobody's thinking about it. I'm sure that there are people on Russell Hill who do think about this. But let me tell you, in all seriousness, it's an error to think that the Defence Department is an organisation where people reach agreement and do the rational and right thing. Maybe nobody in this room believe that anyway, but the armed services bicker over resources. The Navy is internally divided over what platforms should be got. The submariners compete with people who want more surface ships. Right? The Air Force will say we don't need a lot of that kit that the Navy's getting because we need more aeroplanes. The Army will say we're the ones who do all the grunt work. We have all these platforms in the Air Force and the Navy. We never use the Dashnings except for transport. We get sent to foreign conflicts. We're the ones who do the hard work, and we get less funding than they do. And the others will say, yeah, you're all boys with toys. So a question as specific as how exactly we're going to crew submarines can get lost in that, where you can even get a situation where other parts of the Navy are thinking to themselves, well, we couldn't stop them getting the submarine decision through, but if we keep the best available crews for the surface ships, they won't be able to go there, and that'll sort of be mothballed, and that'll show it doesn't really work, and maybe next time they won't get new submarines. That's the way the game's always been played. There's an old story about Churchill saying that before the First World War, he said we had this big debate about whether we should build more dreadnoughts given the German naval build-up, and if so, how many? And we couldn't really agree. Some of us said we should get 6 more dreadnoughts, and some said we should get 8 more dreadnoughts, and being unable to agree, we compromised, and we built 12. That's a quite typically Churchillian remark, but you get the idea. Do I think it matters who wins the US presidential election in a few weeks' time? And of course the answer unequivocally is very much so. I should say that I think it's 2 years ago now, before the primaries had got underway, and certainly before we had these two candidates in the runoff, I wrote an essay in which I said, if I was running the Republican Party, I would be working very hard now to get David Petraeus to run as my candidate. Notwithstanding that, yes, he had a love affair and yes, he leaked a bit of classified information, but let's not get too exercised about that. He's an extraordinary man. He has the track record as a heterodox thinker, as an innovator, as a successful commander, as a man who's taken responsibility in very difficult circumstances and done it well. We need that kind of individual in the White House. Instead, we've got this clown who's running his own show, and we've got Hillary, whose whole campaign now seems to be premised in significant measure on, well, I'll be the first woman to be the president, and that's good enough, isn't it? You know, when Obama became the first black American president, I was deeply moved, right? And I followed his 8 years away with great interest. I look forward a great deal to his memoirs. And it'd be really rather nice to think that Hillary would indeed become the first woman to become president. In present circumstances, we must fervently hope she will, in fact. And that she'll make a good fist of it. You know, I'm not a Hillary hater. In fact, in 1992, when Bill was elected, and I noticed the two of them for the first time, I said to my family and a few friends, why did they nominate Bill instead of Hillary? She seems smarter than him. So, you know, the joke, you know, that went the rounds back in those days, the two of them slipped away from the White House, like in the movie Dave, you know, just for a drive in the countryside, and let's allow that that's possible without a little security detail. So they're in this car and they pull into a gas station, and the fellow comes out and he fills the tank for them, and then he comes to the window and Hillary's in the driving seat, and he says, Hillary, you know, and she says, oh, Charles, what are you doing here? And he said, oh, I've worked out here for years, you know, and she said, oh, gosh. And they chatter away for a little while, and finally he said, oh, well, it's amazing to see you again. And she pays him and off they go, and then Bill says, so who was that? And she says, oh, well, that's Charles. He was a sweetheart of mine before I ever met you. You know, it was a long time ago now. And Bill chortles and he says, yeah, just think what would have happened if you'd married him. And she says, yeah, well, you would have ended up pumping gas and he would have been president of the United States.